Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really ambitious, a proposed theory of everything.
Yeah, that phrase gets tossed around a lot, doesn't it? It's a massive claim. The source material we're looking at today, it's from sections of a book laying out what it calls the deconstruction model.
Or dimensional construction model.
Right.
And the author, well, they're pretty upfront about it. They admit calling it a theory of everything is maybe a bit reckless. But they stand by it. They hope, even if it isn't the final answer, maybe the different way of looking at things could inspire others.
And they do acknowledge potential oversimplifications, especially for, experts in specific fields.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to unpack this alternative perspective on the universe, on existence itself.
We're going to pull out the key definitions, the claims, trace how this model tries to build reality from the ground up.
And see how it attempts to redefine some really fundamental physics concepts. Get ready, because some of these ideas are pretty surprising.
Definitely. Where do we start?
Okay, let's jump in. The source starts in a fascinating place with language. It suggests our everyday words, especially for time, might actually be limiting us.
Right. Words like before or began. They have time built right into their meaning.
So saying something like before time began
becomes kind of illogical if time literally didn't exist in that context.
The author really stresses this point, that our language shapes our perception.
And it can actually stop us from seeing fundamental truths.
That's the argument. Communication itself is seen as a huge hurdle in science because of this.
Okay, so if language is tricky, what about how we currently define time?
Yeah, those definitions get scrutinized too. The source says many are recursive. They use time-related words, continued, period, process, sequence, events, past, present, future, to define time itself.
It's a bit circular, isn't it? Like defining red by saying it's a red color.
Exactly. It describes the effects or measurement of time, not what time is, fundamentally. So the model proposes a really basic core redefinition.
Which is?
Time is the property that results from change. Time is the property that results from change. That simple.
Deceptively simple. And the source actually asks you, the listener, to actively try and suppress years of what education and experience has taught you.
Wow.
And just hold on to that simple definition as we move forward. It's foundational to everything else.
Okay, so if time needs change, you need something to do the changing. Where does existence start in this model? What's the basic building block?
It proposes this fundamental particle called the genion.
A genion. Okay, what is it? How's it described?
Well, it's introduced with a thought experiment. A point. It is.
That's it.
It is.
It is.
Yeah, it's described as a zero-dimensional object. Think about it.
Mm-hmm.
If there's literally nothing else around, how do you measure its size? Or location?
Yeah.
Or speed?
You can't. There's no reference point.
Right. Size, movement, speed, location, they're all irrelevant.
Right.
It's made of nothing smaller. It just is. Pure existence, maybe.
So it's purely illustrative, the absolute minimum starting point.
That seems to be the idea. Now let's link that back to the definition of time.
Yeah.
Time results from change.
Okay, so a single genion, all alone, no change.
Exactly. So for that lone genion, there is no time, no beginning in the way we think of it. Its existence is its complete time frame, a zero-dimensional time frame.
That's the bedrock. Okay, but how do you get from one point to, well, anything?
Yeah.
Dimensions, objects.
Right, this is the construction part. It uses that definition of time. The source says you take two zero-dimensional genions.
Okay, 2 points.
Plus logic. And that interaction, that change, produces a single one-dimensional object, a string.
Ah, because the interaction is the change, which means time exists, and that defines the first dimension.
You got it. And this leads to a really important term they use, dimensional object, or DO.
DO. What does it mean exactly?
A DO isn't just the object like right now. It's the entire time frame of its movement or interaction within its specific dimension, but viewed or interacted with as a whole by another object.
Okay. Can you give the example using the genions and the string?
Sure. A single genion is a 0D object, a zero-dimensional DO. The string, made from two genions interacting. That's a 1D object, a one-dimensional DO.
Why, dear?
Because it contains within itself the entire time frame of all the one-dimensional movement and interaction of the two genions that created it. It's like the complete history of that 1D interaction bundled up. And that 1D string can then go on to interact further.
So the core idea, the deconstruction model, it's like building with Lego dimensions. Interactions create dimensions, which create objects with time frames, which then interact to create higher dimensions.
That's pretty much it. The construction of the dimensions and their interactions gives rise to everything. The claim is it all fits and can be explained this way.
Okay, building on that, what does it mean for something to actually exist in this model?
They give a really practical definition: the physical interaction between objects.
Just interaction.
Yeah. The argument is, if two things never interact, does it matter to each other if they exist? Interaction is what makes things real in a relative sense.
That sounds kind of like causal cones and relativity. If something's outside my light cone, I can't interact with it, so in a way, it doesn't exist for me.
It connects directly.
Right.
The source says anything outside an object's causal cone simply doesn't exist to that object. But language gets tricky again here.
Oh, so?
What about things that are clearly out there, but outside a specific causal cone? Like, those super distant galaxies moving away faster than light?
Right. We can't ever interact with them again, so they don't exist to us causally, but surely they still exist somewhere.
Exactly. So to handle this, the source introduces a new tense. It's kind of unusual.
Existics.
Yeah. It describes things that exist in their own right independently, but maybe not from a specific perspective because they're outside that perspective's causal cone. So star B does existics, but it doesn't exist from star A's view if they can't interact.
That's hard to get your head around using normal language.
It really highlights the limitations again. The source suggests our reality, what we perceive, might be like Plato's cave. Just the shadows, just the bits of dimensional interactions we can actually perceive from our 3D, 4D viewpoint.
And it even suggests we might be missing interactions.
Yeah, it claims at the subatomic level, maybe we only see like half the interactions because others could be happening faster than our causality limit outside our cone.
Mind-bending. Okay, what about the arrow of time? Why does it only seem to go one way for us?
The model proposes each dimension gets its own time arrow. Interactions within a dimension are deterministic following that specific time arrow. Our experience of a one-way flow, past to future in the fourth dimension, is tied to these deterministic interactions unfolding along our dimension's specific time arrow.
Okay, foundation laid. Genians, time from change, dimensions built by interaction, DOs, existence via interaction, existics, dimensional time arrows. Phew. Now, how do we build actual matter? How does this model construct, say, a hydrogen atom?
Right. This is where it gets really concrete and makes some bold claims.
Yeah.
It says familiar particles like protons and electrons, they're actually built dimensionally from genions.
Okay, let's break it down. The proton.
In this model, the proton is simply that one-dimensional string object we talked about, formed from two genions interacting one-dimensionally.
So the proton is a 1D DO, and the electron.
The electron is described as a single genion, but it's interacting in a two-dimensional way with the proton.
Okay, so a 1D proton, two genions, and a 2D electron, one genion, interacting. Put them together and you get
a hydrogen atom. Oh. The source describes it as basically a two-dimensional construct. It involves three genions total, two for the proton, one for the electron. They interact in the first and second dimensional time zones.
Okay.
Then this 2D structure is sort of spun in the third dimension, which gives it a spherical kind of form factor. And finally, we reference this whole thing from our fourth dimensional time arrow. That's our perspective on it.
Whoa. Okay. How does that relate to quantum mechanics, like the electron cloud, probabilities, superposition?
This is a key connection the model tries to make. It suggests that the electron's entire 2D orbital time frame, remember the DO concept, when we view it from our 4D perspective, it looks like a probability map. It looks like its superposition state.
Because we're seeing all its 2D possibilities at once from our higher dimension.
Kind of. We're seeing the projection of its complete deterministic 2D path or time frame onto our perspective. And spinning that 2D orbit in 3D naturally generates shapes like the spherical one's orbital cloud we observe. So it connects the simple construction to the quantum weirdness.
And the claim is you don't need quarks or anything else, at least initially, for this. Just the genions interacting dimensionally.
That's the initial claim, yeah. It simplifies the particle zoo right down, at least for hydrogen. It does mention dealing with quarks later, but the basic atom is just these dimensional constructs.
What about mass, then? If it's just genions, where does mass come from?
Mass is defined really simply as the dimensional referencing of genions. Think of a heavy object like a wrecking ball versus a beach ball. The wrecking ball just contains vastly more of these fundamental lower dimensional time frame references within its structure. It's harder to move because you're interacting with and trying to change the referencing state of way more of these basic building blocks.
More interactions to overcome. Okay, so if matter is dimensional interactions, what about forces? gravity, electromagnetism, nuclear forces.
Another big redefinition. In the deconstruction model, a force is simply the dimensional interaction between two or more dimensional objects. That's it.
So forces aren't separate fundamental things. They are the interactions that build dimensions.
Exactly. And each dimensional interaction is effectively an attraction that helps create or define the next higher dimension.
Can we use the hydrogen atom again, examples?
Sure. The attraction between the two genies that forms the 1D proton string. That interaction is the first dimensional force. The electron interacting two-dimensionally with the proton to form the atom. That's the second dimensional force. The whole thing being referenced by spin in 3D. That involves the third dimensional force.
So the model implies, what, a fundamental force for each dimension?
Yes. It suggests there are actually more fundamental forces than the standard model's four, one for each dimension, and potentially others.
And gravity, where does that fit in?
Gravity gets described as the interaction of fourth-dimensional objects, things in our familiar space-time that are involved in forming the fifth dimension.
So it's still fundamental, but derived differently.
Right. And the source suggests it might actually be the combined effect of all the higher dimensional interactions above our fourth, just getting weaker as you go up in dimension number.
Okay, let's shift to light. Electromagnetic radiation. How does this dimensional model handle that?
First, it rebrands it. It calls EM radiation Dyer radiation.
Dyer.
Yeah, for dimensional reference radiation. Because the model sees it as fundamentally about transferring dimensional references, not just classical electric and magnetic fields.
And light itself is?
Light is essentially the dimensional references traveling without the matter that originally created them, like the blueprint traveling without the building.
What about wave-particle duality, that core mystery of light?
The model claims there's no real duality enigma here. The wave nature comes from the combined dimensional probabilities when you consider interactions between different time arrows or causal cones.
Okay.
And the particle nature, the photon, is just how these combined references get bundled up and quantized into traveling packets. Specifically, it links these packets back to the references of the electron's orbit. So wave and particle are just two ways our perspective interacts with the same underlying dimensional reference transfer.
Interesting. What about the speed of light? Still constant.
Variable, actually, according to the source, at least when passing through a medium. A medium here means more than just air or water. It means navigating different levels or densities of dimensional stuff. The speed is only seen as constant in a vacuum from our specific 4D perspective.
And things like polarization, reflection, refraction, how are those explained?
They're explained by how the photon's dimensional references, remember, those are tied to the electron's 2D orbital references, interact with the dimensional references of atoms in the material it hits.
So light bouncing off water.
That's seen as the photon's 2D references hitting, say, the oxygen atom's 2D orbital references at the surface. Refraction is about the light's references navigating through similar dimensional space within the material.
Let's bring this to the double slit experiment, the classic quantum weirdness test. Electron acts like a wave, then a particle. How does this model explain that without breaking determinism?
Okay, this is a key explanatory point for the model. It claims the interference pattern, the wave-like behavior, happens because our perspective from the fourth dimension is viewing the electron's entire 2D deterministic time frame all at once.
The whole dio.
Exactly. And that complete 2D time frame inherently includes the references of it having passed through both slits from its 2D perspective.
But when we measure it, it seems to pick one path. How does that work?
The model says measuring it, pinning down its location in our 3D space and time, essentially forces our perspective to interact with only one part of its 2D time frame. It removes the references of the other paths from our view.
And it doesn't matter when we measure.
Apparently not, according to the source, because our interaction is with the electron's entire perpendicular time frame, regardless of our own time coordinate. Recording its location breaks the wholeness of that time frame for us.
So it claims to explain the quantum outcome, the pattern appearing or disappearing without needing wave function collapse or inherent randomness?
Just perspective on a deterministic lower dimension.
That's the core argument. It interprets things like probability clouds and superposition not as fundamental states, but as results of us viewing a complete deterministic lower dimensional time frame from our higher dimensional perspective.
Okay, moving up in complexity. Atomic nuclei, chemical bonds, states of matter. How does the deconstruction model build these? For atomic nuclei, the source suggests a different approach to stability. It uses helium cores, 2 protons, 2 neutrons, as sort of fundamental stable building blocks.
Like pre-made Lego bricks?
Kinda, yeah. It argues this helps explain observed patterns in element abundance and why certain isotopes are stable. They represent different stable ways of arranging these helium core units.
But how do they stick together? Protons should repel.
This introduces another concept: intradimensional causal zones. Overlapping causal bubbles of the protons create these zones. One specific type inside the nucleus is called the Lime zone.
Lime zone, okay. And neutrons.
Neutrons get redefined here. A neutron is described as basically a hydrogen atom setup. So 3 GeV total, but it's time framed within this Lime zone. It effectively becomes a 2D object filling that zone.
And that provides binding.
Yes. The neutrons, as these 2D objects filling the Lime zone, act as the binding force holding the protons together.
What about radioactive decay then? Alpha, beta, gamma.
Alpha decay is seen pretty simply as ejecting one of those helium cores, the basic stable block. The energy released is just the conversion of dimensional referencing within that core structure as it breaks apart.
You mentioned the source notes, a link to string theory's 10 dimensions here.
Yeah, just a brief mention. It counts. 1D proton, 2D neutron in the Lime zone, the 3D structure of the nucleus, the electron orbit referenced via 3D spin, plus our 4th dimensional time arrow. That adds up to 10 dimensions potentially involved in just building an atom. Kind of interesting.
Okay, gamma radiation.
That's redefined as high-frequency Dyer radiation, or dimensional reference radiation. Specifically, it's referencing the internal structure of the core, the 2D and 3D time frames within the nucleus. It's seen as a byproduct of changes like alpha or beta decay or fission fusion.
Beta decay. In standard physics, that involves neutrinos. Where are they in this model? It seems like a big test.
But it is, and it's another radical redefinition. The model claims the neutrino and other leptons, apart from the electron, are not particles.
Not particles? Then what are they?
They're redefined as very high-frequency Dyer radiation, a specific type called Pac radiation. This radiation references the inner core's first dimension, the proton strings.
So the different lepton flavors, their slight mass differences.
The source suggests that those reflect slightly different time frames of the genions involved in the core structure being referenced by this Pac radiation. And it proposes that neutrino detectors, like the big water tanks, aren't actually seeing particles, but are detecting this Pac radiation interacting.
Wow. That completely changes the picture. What about antimatter, like the positron, anti-electron?
It's described as possibly an electron interacting in an opposing 2D time arrow or time frame, or maybe just having an opposite spin characteristic that causes it to dereference orbitals when it meets a regular electron.
Okay, let's move outside the nucleus to chemical bonding. Covalent bonds, where atoms share electrons.
Right. Remember, electrons are genions with a 2D time frame around the nucleus. For a covalent bond, the causal bubbles of the atoms overlap. This creates a new, higher-level intradimensional zone between them called the MEFA zone.
MEFA zone, like the Lime zone in the nucleus.
A similar concept, but between atoms for bonding. And here's the twist. The electrons involved in the bond, they fill this MEFA zone as a single one-dimensional object, a string, called the electron pair object, or EPO.
EPO. The bond itself is a 1D object made of the electrons.
That's the claim. This 1D EPO string is the binding force, and the reason we don't just measure a 1D string is that any interaction collapses its dimensional timeframes from our perspective, making us see only the 2 constituent electrons we expect.
Which ties back to the idea of no fundamental charge, right?
Exactly. It's crucial. The model insists positive and negative charges don't exist as inherent properties. All attraction and repulsion comes down to these dimensional interactions, overlapping bubbles, and whether these zones, Lime, MEFA, and another called SACA, are referenced or unreferenced. Unreferenced zones cause repulsion. Filled reference zones cause attraction or binding.
Does this explain molecular shapes, bond angles?
It suggests they relate to how flexibly the electron shells or orbitals can be referenced dimensionally, and also the underlying arrangements of the atomic cores themselves.
And ionic bonding, like salt crystals.
That's presented as a more complex version of shared covalent bonding, involving multiple 3D interactions between molecules that lock them into a lattice. The model says this aligns well with measuring ionic bond strength by the strength of the crystal lattice.
Okay, how about the basic states of matter? Solid, liquid, gas.
Those depend on the interplay of pressure, temperature in these 2D, 3D interactions, bonding molecular arrangements. And entropy, the tendency towards disorder, is framed as an emergent effect.
Emergent from what?
From these basic dimensional interactions. Specifically, the repulsion caused by unreferenced MEFA and SACA zones is what drives things to spread out, which we perceive as increasing entropy. Even mixing gases involves these repulsions, plus other subtle forces like first-dimensional atomic alignments.
Let's apply this to thermodynamics. Energy flow, heat.
The model sees the laws of thermodynamics as consistent with this dimensional view. Zerth law, equilibrium, first law, conservation of energy. These work through the transfer of dimensional referencing.
How is energy itself defined again?
The transferable combination of values or time frames of dimensional referencing by our fourth dimensional time arrow. Basically, the ability to pass on those interaction references.
And heat energy specifically.
Heat energy is identified with the energy of the Saka zone, that's the 3D intradimensional zone. When electrons reference these Saka zones, that's heat. More referencing means more repulsion, leading to thermal expansion.
So thermal conductivity depends on how well these Saka zones connect in a material.
Precisely. Diamond conducts heat well because its Saka zones are highly interlocked. Manganese, poorly because they're isolated. Carbon nanotubes conduct well along the tube because the Saka zones link up that way.
And how does energy actually transfer between molecules in this view?
3 ways mentioned. Direct dimensional, a single gene referenced across dimensions. Adjacent transfer, like heat moving between nearby Saka zones. And re-referencing, an electron carrying energy between different zones like Saka and Mifa.
Does enthalpy fit in?
Yeah, it's seen as a good measure of total energy. It includes the inner tongue of dimensional referencing, plus the outer stuff like heat and pressure, Saka zone referencing, helps make sense of exothermic endothermic reactions.
And entropy, the second law, one more time.
The drive towards spread out states, increasing entropy, fundamentally comes from the repulsion of unreferenced Mifa and Saka zones. It's the net result of all these underlying dimensional forces pushing things apart unless they're bound.
Okay, let's tackle 2 big ones. Magnetism and electricity. How does the deconstruction model redefine these forces?
Starting with magnetism. This is another major redefinition. Magnetism is claimed to be the direct result of atomic nuclei aligning. Specifically, the alignment of the first dimensional time arrow of the protons in the atom's central helium core structure.
Whoa. So the north and south poles of a magnet are literally aligned 1D time arrows of the protons inside.
That's the picture. The poles reflect this 1D time arrow and its associated causal cone. Attraction happens when opposite poles bring their time arrows into alignment. This reinforces the interaction, creating attraction, assuming the atoms are locked in place structurally.
And repulsion is when same poles force the time arrows to oppose.
Right. That opposition creates areas akin to those unreferenced repulsion zones we talked about earlier. Hence, they push apart.
Okay, magnetism as aligned 1D core time arrows. What about electricity? You said earlier, no fundamental charge.
Correct. The model is emphatic. Charge doesn't exist as an innate property. What we call charge is actually the combined effect of specific dimensional interactions in zones.
So electric current isn't electrons flowing because they're charged?
Not exactly. AC current generation is described as physical 3D movement reorienting atoms and those electron pair objects, EPOs, in the bonds. This reorientation releases the Mifa zone references associated with the EPOs, and the flow of those references is the electrical energy, the current.
And voltage, what's voltage potential?
Voltage is redefined as the one-dimensional energy stored within the Mifa zones. It's the difference in the EPO's time frame referencing potential between 2 points. Higher voltage means more available, Mifa zone energy, denser reference packing.
What about static electricity? Rubbing a balloon on your hair?
That's seen as friction causing a conversion of heat energy, Saka zones, into electrical energy, Mifa zones, facilitated by electrons that can reference both zones. Lightning is just a massive potential difference of this EPO energy across the distance.
And electric arc jumping a gap.
That's the transference of the 1D EPO energy, the voltage across that gap.
Yeah.
It shows the sort of dimensional distance the EPO's 1D state can bridge in our 3D world.
How does this model interpret the classic picture of an electromagnetic wave with the perpendicular oscillating electric and magnetic fields?
It reinterprets that signature completely. The magnetic field part is seen as reflecting the aligned 1D time arrows of the atomic cores. The electric field part reflects the aligned 1D time arrow of the EPOs in the Mifa zones.
So they're both effects of aligned 1D objects.
Yes, emergent relative effects. They appear linked and perpendicular in the wave because the core structure and the bonding structure where the EPO lives are inherently linked in the atom. Light, dioradiation, is the combined transfer of these dimensional references. And something like the thermoelectric effect heat into electricity makes sense because electrons can reference both Saka, heat, and Mifa electric zones, allowing direct energy conversion between them.
Okay, let's zoom way out. Cosmology, relativity, Big Bang, dark matter, dark energy. How does the deconstruction model approach these cosmic scales?
With relativity, The model suggests the speed of causality isn't an absolute universal limit. It can be breached, but externally to our perceived reality. Our causal cone is just our local neighborhood in a potentially much larger existence.
So those galaxies receding faster than light
Aren't necessarily a paradox.
Right.
They support this idea. They don't exist to us anymore causally, but they absolutely exist in their own right outside our bubble.
What about time dilation paradoxes like twin paradox?
The source claims relative dilation effects simply reverse when the twins reunite, as their causal cones reconverge. You end up with one consistent timeline, no actual age difference paradox. It also notes genions, being 0D, have no relativistic time arrow, and conservation of energy holds because energy, dimensional referencing, exists across multiple dimensional time arrows, not just ours.
And Schrodinger's cat, the alive-dead superposition.
Reinterpreted again. The model says we're just viewing the complete deterministic time frame of a single outcome, cat lives or cat dies, from our outside perspective. The cat is one or the other in its own time frame.
So observing doesn't cause the outcome.
No. Observing just resolves the ambiguity for us by fixing the cat's state in our 3D time, removing the references to the alternative path from our viewpoint. The model argues this maintains determinism within the cat's own dimension and avoids needing multiverses. It keeps warning that our 3D 4D analogies can mislead us about lower dimensions.
Okay, the Big Bang. The model doesn't like space-time as a backdrop.
Right. Because in this model, our fourth dimensional time results from 3D interactions creating 4D space. So talking about the very beginning requires really careful language about which time you mean.
Can the model accommodate a Big Bang-like event?
A very quick start, from our perspective, seems plausible, yeah. If you imagine framing all possible initial genion interactions, maybe that leads to a rapid cascade. The source even speculates about cycles of dimensional collapse and explosion. But the key point is, from our fourth dimensional time arrow's perspective, there wasn't a moment in our time when the Big Bang happened. Because our time hadn't started yet, it begins with 3D object interaction. The very early universe is creating time itself through interaction, making it inherently complex to describe from within time. So yes, it can support a Big Bang, but redefines what that means relative to time.
What about cosmological redshift? Distant galaxies looking redder.
Explained differently, it's suggested to be an apparent optical or time illusion. We're seeing light from when the universe was different, when electrons dimensionally reference slightly different interactions due to the changing overall state of universal interactions back then.
And the cosmic microwave background, CMB, that afterglow.
An alternative is proposed. Maybe it relates to the relative orientation of third-dimensional time arrows across the cosmos, influenced by all the surrounding matter, perhaps even by higher dimensional interactions whose own time frames are now complete from our perspective.
Okay, the big unknowns. Dark matter and dark energy. What are they in this model?
Two more big redefinitions. Dark matter is proposed to be the gravitational attraction coming from referenced higher dimensional interactions, the forces involved in creating the fifth, maybe sixth dimensions.
So gravity from dimensions beyond ours.
Essentially, yes. The referenced attractive part of those higher dimensions.
And dark energy, the accelerating expansion.
That's defined as the repulsion coming from unreferenced higher dimensional indica zones, those empty repulsive zones in higher dimensions. The universe might be expanding into these unreferenced zones.
So gravity is attraction from referenced higher dimensions. Dark energy is repulsion from unreferenced ones.
That's the gist of the explanation offered by the source. Dimensional forces playing out on a cosmic scale.
Okay, let's wrap up with maybe the most profound area. Life and consciousness. How does this dimensional framework even begin to approach these?
Well, the definitions offered are tentative, acknowledging the immense complexity. Life is described kind of poetically as having a quite different fourth dimensional shape or structure compared to non-living things.
Like the rope man animation analogy.
Exactly. Life looks fundamentally different over its entire time frame. It changes, evolves, uses external bits to grow. It isn't static like a rock across its 4D existence.
But life seems to fight entropy, creating order. How does that fit?
The source suggests that's just our 3D perspective. While life creates local order here, it proposes that in higher dimensions, life might actually be following the standard entropic principle energy flowing from high to low potential. Our perceived entropy might just be an emergent effect in our dimension.
What about chirality, the left-right-handedness of biological molecules?
Pure speculation of the source, but it wonders if it might be linked to how the relative effects of fundamental time arrows influence DNA construction way back, setting a kind of handedness keystone for all life that follows. and changing those time arrow orientations.
Could be catastrophic.
Yeah.
The source suggests that if the fundamental orientations were different, the precise chemical interactions needed for life might be impossible, maybe limiting the forms life can take or preventing it altogether.
Finally, consciousness. The ultimate question.
Yeah. The model links it tentatively to awareness, which it breaks down into perception, interpreting senses, and knowledge, recording information, memory.
And the dimensional perspective on that awareness.
It suggests consciousness appears to be the use of 3D timeframes. That's our memories of the past, our perception of the present. Using those to navigate the fourth dimensional time arrow, planning for and moving into the future. So consciousness itself might be
regarded as a fourth dimensional object or structure, an entity that operates across time frames along the 4D arrow. The source even muses that memories themselves might be 4D structures or have a 4D aspect.
And sleep.
Could be part of the process, maybe related to reframing or consolidating these dimensional recordings. We need to process information and navigate our 4D existence.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a deep dive indeed. This deconstruction model, it really does offer a fundamentally different lens on, well, everything.
It absolutely does. The core idea of building reality from these interacting genions and their dimensional time frames forces a redefinition of so many concepts we take for granted. Force, charge, time, light, mass, existence itself. They all become emergent effects.
And hopefully for you, the listener, this journey gave you a good overview of this really intricate alternative viewpoint. It shows how a few, maybe simple, foundational ideas can be layered up to try and explain incredible complexity.
And that final idea from the source, that consciousness itself might be a four-dimensional structure, using past and present time frame to navigate the future. What is that thought that your own awareness, your consciousness, might actually span dimensions? What does that change about how you think about your place in it all?
Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.